Now, okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. We want to invite everyone to take your seats so that we can start the next panel. Please welcome Safeguarding Press Freedom Amidst Journalism Safety Perspective from the Academia, done within the framework of the celebration of UNESCO's World Press Freedom Day, now being celebrated in Santiago de Chile. On behalf of the hosting universities of this event, the School of Image and Communication from Universidad de Chile and the School of Communication of Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, we would like to welcome you. At the end of this session, we will have a Q&A for the panelists, and I would like to announce those who are watching the YouTube transmission that we are now doing the transmission in English, but in the next few days, we're going to upload the version in Spanish. Now we're going to start with a panel called On Protection of the Press in Chile, Threats, Censorship, Espionage, and Other Types of Aggressions Against Journalists in Hostile Environments. In this panel, we will be joined by researchers Javier Garcia from the Law School of Universidad de las Américas, Ed Carter from Brigham Young University, María José Labrador from Universidad del Desarrollo, Paulina Maureria, and Fernando Gutiérrez Atala, also from Universidad del Desarrollo. So now we're going to start with Professor Ed Carter. I would like to say as well that panelists have prepared one presentation, therefore they are going to exchange or giving the floor to the next speaker. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this conference. A few years ago, I realized how journalists were being attacked, and we put together a project, a collaboration between academics in several countries, and we are amidst that. We are still coordinating the publishing of our work, and one of the investigations is the one that they are going to present my colleagues here. Just as a coordinator of an academic review regarding safety for journalists and the struggle against impunity when it comes to attacks against journalists. So it has been important work. It has been very difficult because we are coordinating among many countries in Africa, in Europe, in South America. But I've had the pleasure of working with people that are dedicated to play the role of journalists in society. And for me, this has been such a joy to see the dedication of several cultures to the idea that journalism can help society, but that the quality of that journalism depends on our conduct and behaviors towards journalists and the content of journalism. So now I'm going to give the floor to the professors and academics that are going to present now, and I want to congratulate them. And very soon we're going to see their publications. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and precisely within the framework of this initiative of the BYU University that Professor Carter was telling us about, is that we carried out an international symposium in order to assess exploratorily what were the main threats that journalists were going through in the last few years. In the same context, we, professors of Universidad del Desarrollo, Professor Rodrigo Álvarez from Universidad de Santiago as well, carried out an investigation that places its objective in identifying threats, censorship, espionage, and any other kind of aggression towards journalists, but especially in areas of conflict. This study has two important axes. The first that aims at identifying what are those threats, and the second that aims at identifying if they suffer digital attacks or on social media against those journalists that cover conflict situations. In the contextual framework, I would like to comment different studies, different indexes, and different classifications in which Chile has been present for many years now. First, I want to say that Chile, since it returned to democracy, has been a very important country as one of the countries that had a good freedom of the press. In the last classifications from even 10 or 15 years ago, it didn't show as a concerning country. Even in the UN framework, Chile sponsored or co sponsored several resolutions that are related to protecting journalists, and it even participates in the friends groups for journalist safety. However, in the World Classification of Reporters Without Borders from 2019, it dropped 21 positions when comparison to 2017. In other indexes, we have Freedom House and others that are used as measuring tools of different organizations of the press that placed Chile as a country where there were no persecutions or any measures against journalists. However, the report on 2019 from the rapporteur for freedom of speech place a special accent on vigilance and media espionage and communicators, something that had already been denounced in many countries of the region. This is why we placed special emphasis in carrying out an exploratory study that could allow us to account for what was going on conflict areas, particularly in the southern part of the country, in the north part of the country, and in the center of the country. In the south, as you can see, this is a highly conflictive area. It's an area of Chile that presents several complexities in journalist coverage. As you can see, the Undersecretariat of the Interior, in its last report of 2022, provides details that this area is constantly attacked by violent facts that we can categorize in the following way: incendiary attacks, shootings or the presence of weapons of fire, attacks or confrontations with police officers, road disruptions, violent disruptions, occupations, illegal entering, and thievery of private property. And as you know, we have several fatal victims in all categories. Now, on the other hand, on the northern area, we see that the insecurity problems have increased in the last few years, and the three main important issues in that region, according to several surveys, among them the feedback research that is carried out by the Institute of Public Policies from Universidad Católica, particularly in the region of Antofagasta, they say that biggest issues, and 34% is drug dealing, the cost of life, another 34%, and illegal immigration without control, which reaches a 16%. Now, what are the objectives and the methodologies that we deployed so that we could identify what these threats were? Well, in terms of the general objective, we're not going to see the methodology, but I want to share the objectives of, of this investigation. We want to identify threats, censorship, espionage, and other kinds of aggression in when covering aggressions and how to classify these aggressions. How did we understood these categories? We understood them as themes with implications of the problem, analytical resources. Also, we had data, similar results from journalists in semi-structured interviews, and we separated into categories under certain criteria, either equal, explicit, or concrete, as the ones that Professor Maureen is going to share with us. Good morning. Thank you, Maria Jose. I want to say that throughout this work that we carried out between December 2022 and February 2023, we worked together with a research assistant, Maria Jesus Fuente, who was crucial to create these connections with those journalists that were found along the north and the southern area of the country, and the journalists on investigative journalists here in Santiago. Well, our methodology was exploratory, qualitative. We worked with semi structured interviews along with 14 journalists that had the category to cover conflictive areas. Those were one of the inclusion criterion, the criteria the what of who we interviewed. They had to be a part of a radio, a TV, or the press, either in national coverage or on local media. We also worked with key informants once we finished with the interviews to journalists, and we worked with people from the presidency and with the Media Federation, editors of regional media, the president of the, the school for regional journalists, the ones in charge of safety in Araucanía, and a regional director. Now, what were the dimensions that we were able to gather in the interviews to journalists? First, the development of their of their career, their coverage on the conflictive areas, the threats they've received when they are exercising their professions. We also saw some transversal contents, how they showed in the journalists' coverage in conflicted areas, and what were their final reflections? What can they reflect upon when covering these kinds of conflicts? Out of the 14 interviewees, we were able to observe that out of the 14, 6 had experience in drug dealing, 10 in the conflict in Araucanía. These were not just professionals from the south, but also specialized professionals that come from the central area to cover the most conflictive moments in this very particular area. 3 from the central area that travel to the north to cover the most conflictive moments, and only 1 had declared experience in migration issues. 2 of them had covered social conflicts where they presented that they had more issues, and 6 of them covered crime. Now, how did they receive the threat in the professional exercise? We were able to observe that 10 verbally, 6 declared physical threats, 1 tension, some of them on social media, and only 2 did not experience any kind of threats. When we talk about espionage, 6 declared that they were being followed, one received the phone calls, phone interventions, six are detected this, social media, six, and two did not. And now, regarding censorship, by their own means of communications, four declared, three observed that groups of power promote censorship, three promoted from organizations and institutions, two self censored, and six did not experience this. When we now go to what are the transversal contents when exercising their work, we observed that out of the 14 people that were interviewed, 9 manifest difficulties to access information when we are going through a conflictive situation in those areas, and 8 of them manifested having timely access to information through the law of transparency. When they worked undercover, everyone declared that it is highly unsafe and that they had done this. These are some of the first conclusions that we can draw in this work of exploratory interviews. We also want to mention that this was very complicated and it was impossible to access journalists in the north part. And this is very curious. It's curious that they don't want to speak. So, those who are here, those who are exercising journalism, we have to stop and think. The South has been a conflictive area for over 20 years, and they've covered the relationship between the state and the indigenous peoples. There are work conditions that allow to have journalists covering the South feeling safe. They have trainings, they have vehicles they are protected. They have self trained to do so. But now in the north, where this is just coming up, and we are seeing this according to what Professor Labrador indicates, this is just booming. And we, in this search for journalists, we were scared when we started knocking on doors. So, in this context, is where we need to ask ourselves what is happening in the north with the exercise of journalism, and how is it being actually covered? How is deep investigation being carried out and not just the red note from the police coverage? Javier, thank you for this invitation. Thank you for inviting me with this group where we started working on these issues on security of the press in Chile. And unfortunately, I do share this diagnosis and this difficulty of addressing this particular situation. We don't have enough documentation available. There's a lot of resistance to meetings. And I'm going to present what has been two of my work areas. Currently, I'm a professor of the law school of Universidad de las Americas, but this is something that I've been observing from the communication study, which is a nonprofit organization where we started articulating since 2018 that worked on aggressions, especially to photojournalists, community media, and we saw that there were a lot of invisibilized aggressions. Well, on 2023, we were awarded a UNESCO project where we have international financing also in the plan for this. So we created a methodology of work and also sub indicators because we created a report according to a series of informations, but and this was very complicated, and because of the lack of documentation, and because we had to get together with different stakeholders in key organizations. Here also with us we have Pilar Zamora that joined us in this very difficult task of applying these indicators, and it was very complicated, it was very complex to move forward in this way. And we, after a year, we were able to create this investigation. So what we did, we can see some figures there to the different stakeholders that we interviewed, what are the statistics and how the UNESCO methodology of these indicators of journalist security define their work in four areas that have to do with state stakeholders, civil society and academia, the means of communications, and organizations that represent them, and also the role that the United Nations plays, and also the system of American states through the Inter American Commission. We can see the 66 people that participated in this study. Some of them were very difficult to interview, even some of them refused or find excuses not to participate in the study. We wanted to have this diversity, and there are people in this room that we interviewed. For example, I want to thank Sebastian Zarate because we had a very productive conversation in this way. Just a few conclusions that we were able to find, that we were able to draw from this report, data that had to do with 2019 and 2023 in a long period of time, but also responding to these questions. We provided further detail and we included some key dates, but these were more statistical in this study. And we presented the fact that we had all the situation that happens in every country in Latin America. This means the scenario was not so different from other countries. These are the same situations: online aggression, physical aggression, espionage, even the murder of Francisca Sandoval 2 years ago. So the intensities are very diverse, they vary, but unfortunately, when we saw the reports of other countries, we said we are very similar and we're getting even more similar. The trends are very similar. We were even at, we were even a- we were even able to identify a case of exile in Chile, a preventive exile that a Chilean journalist actually performed. Something that we saw in other countries, but not in Chile, and something that really concerned us. For us, the main conclusion was not just that this was going on or how intense it was, but rather Chile and the involved stakeholders and the different bodies are not prepared to face this scenario. We are now in a scenario as if things don't happen. There's a lot of lack of organization, and the state is not doing its job either. There's no record. We used to have more information than the state and any other state organization. They didn't know what was going on. And then the information was fragmented. Each organization had their own kinds of organization, but from their own experiences, and there wasn't any shared knowledge. But the concerning thing is from the state not having the appropriate mechanisms, not having specialized workers, not having a record, not having protocols. And what we did make progress is the awareness of the risk. Now is even higher from the more mediatic incidents, the Ivan Núñez incident, the murder of Francisca Sandoval, and other incidents that have happened. But the initiatives that are being developed to face these situations are very modest. The regulatory measures are still under paperwork, under bureaucracy, and we don't have an institutional dialogue for coordinated work. What else? We have a bill of law for the protection of journalists and communications workers that is being discussed in the Senate, but this is very declarative and it does not include concrete or institutional measures. This is, for example, having a obligation of having a record, but there's not a mechanism. It does not carry a mandate that indicates that they have to carry out certain measures. And the most recent thing of these less known cases, less than a month ago, they approved the protocol of people protecting human rights that has to do with the Escazú agreement in order to create a mechanism to create environmental advocates. And the Chilean state decided to widen this to any kind of human rights advocates, including the press. But this is a very modest mechanism. This comes without any kind of financing, which leaves unclear what happens to the different reports and denounces. Those who are not considered crimes, and it's very unclear how they're going to be dealt with. So, with this bill of law, that also comes without a budget. So, we are in a situation where we are facing insufficient measures. Once the protocol is approved, we are still not answering, we're not responding to the current issues and how laws are approved and are applied without any diagnosis. So, designing public policies from the lack of knowledge and the lack of diagnosis to draft this. And women, of course, they are exposed to high risks. And we also alerted the problem of lies and liabilities in the press. We saw a case where it was told that this was incompatible with the Inter American Court, that civils should complain about journalists. After this sentence, not only the number of reports and denounces have dropped of lawsuits of these kinds of legal harassment, but rather it has increased. In the last few months, we've recorded at least 5 cases. So we still need to react quicker. And throughout the years, it's something that we've seen from 2023, we've recorded 426 incidents with the least capacity in that moment. And in here, we see the diversity of what we were able to identify, what we could do, because the other record comes from the public forces injury. So what we're seeing here is the tip of the iceberg. This means that 90% of what we are seeing here is just aggressions from the police officers. It's not that there are no more people that commit aggressions, but are the ones that we were able to document. But also, I'm telling you, and I will repeat this, the police officers are the biggest agents of aggression against the press. And we were able to identify the patterns of injuries, how they started. First of all, they started using police weapons and then arbitrary detention. On 2020, we almost had 80 arbitrary detentions, and one of the detainees 10 days ago was condemned to 60 days in jail for public disorganization, when public disorder, when they were just covering, and they said that they threw stones at some point.
Quite concerning. And these milestones, which are the most alarming ones, alarming incidents that are telling us what is happening here. We had hundreds of cases during the social uprising. We understand that this is going to happen, but 75 detentions, which were arbitrary during the pandemic, the attack against the equipment of Ivan Nunez, and 3 reporters wounded by bullets on May the 1st, with surrounded by even the police, with the death of Francisca Sandoval, and a cameraman wounded by a bullet on September the 1st when he was covering in Valladolid. Now I'm going to talk about a bit more updated work, the work which we've done in the last year. The Observatory for Right and Communication started being part of a network that articulates Latin America. They do a report with a common methodology, and we presented this report not so long ago. It includes Chile. We can see a benchmark with other countries, but this is the data that we gathered from Chile. I'd like to thank Jorge Abiner I don't know if he's in the room or not because he's responsible for these. Now, the Observatory of the Communication Rights, it records. Jorge recorded all these incidents, more than 80 incidents. There's more than 60% that are physical and or verbal aggressions, 4 arbitrary detentions by the police, 7 cases of legal harassment, a restriction to the access of information, and 18 incidents were perpetrated by police. The agents of state are the ones that provoke more aggressions to press, not only the police forces, which are always or face more complex situations, but in all countries, it's natural this appears, all these police aggressions, but we also find stigmatizing speeches by who? By our own president of the republic. If our own president has this speech, who is not going to do that, right? It's going to be validated for everyone. It's quite aggressive. Some people say, okay, he was going to respond. No, a president cannot do these type of things because they're opening the floor for others to do this. And the alert we have in other countries in Latin America is be careful with the stigmatizing speech or discourse. It's the first one. It's the gate to generating a scale. There's a scale up of everything. So this is in the report we published yesterday on the internet, and we will be sharing more information, and you'll be able to check in our social media. And the greatest aggressor of 2023 is still Carabineros, or the Chilean peace or police force, but it's diversified. The patterns in Chile is, well, police aggressions, and others no patterns are multiple. There's multiple stakeholders participating. The number of stakeholders that have the profile of aggressors, they increase, and the type, and there's quite significant that the independent media, the local media from regions, the most vulnerable media are targeted. They're a focus for aggression more than cyber. Cyber's not as vulnerable, right? It's not, doesn't look good to go against cyber, but they just go against the small media, small scale. A concession media, this is a summary. You had 3 claims by public servants from different parties in a year, and 2 fire attacks. They're stigmatized. They were called activist press. They said they weren't journalists, and others said, okay, no, I will not file the claim. I'll have this incendiary attack, or the investigation not advanced that much, and no authorities said anything. They had the arsonist attack, and they said, okay, you know what's happening in Concepcion? Why isn't any authorities, why aren't they talking about this, right? And in Temuco, there was an aggression not so long ago to a reporter from Bio Bio, also local TV staff equipment, and the local authorities, they went out and sentenced the facts, right? The authorities have to give an example, provide an example, and condemn the facts. There's victims that have increasingly more aggression. They have increasingly more aggressions that happen in the social uprising. The TV staff, they stopped going. The cameramen, they stopped going out to the streets. Now they, in every coverage, people don't want witnesses, so they attack them. I'm not only about speaking about news cameramen, right? Most of these aggressions to TV staffs are to the. We had different meetings, and they say they did not share our perceptions. Some people say that they have very good protocols because they're a company that depends from the US, and the safety protocols are quite demanding there. And two months later, one of his cameramen there's a bullet in Lo Vallador, right? They shot at him. The press is in the front line of the streets. Well, the second street. Well, the first one is the police force, but how to the police force go out to march or to the riots, they go with bulletproof vests. You have to look at the press. Are they trained? Yes, on TVN I knew about the protocols are doing great, but when I spoke with the cameraman or woman of TVN, they said, okay, I don't know them. Have they informed you about these safety and security protocols? No, that's a scenario we're currently facing. Therefore, alert is the alert is that we're not facing the situation. None of the stakeholders are. So society, because we don't have the capacity to do so. The state, because it's not engaging enough with the budgets, with good measures. But companies, they have to train, they have to activate training measures and equipment. Large media can do it, but the small media do not have this capacity. Unfortunately, that is a dramatic situation which we're currently facing. And this is last year broken down on a table. We'll continue generating data, but we're seeing here that trends and patterns change according to the region, the type of regressions they change. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We do not know what's happening in regions of Chile. I'm sorry I extended. In terms of time, I'd like to announce that we would like to publish the UNESCO indicators report. Well, it's delayed, right? Due to red tape, bureaucracy of international entities like UNESCO. We believe that these type of reports are quite necessary, and would like to invite you to follow us through the media, social media. I'm going to share the observatory information with you, and we're doing great. It's doing great work in monitoring and recording, and that they're opening their work to investigators. So I'd like to invite everyone to generate application based on data and to follow the observatory. Thank you. Thank you very much to all the professors, and we'll have our last intervention by Fernando Gutierrez from Universidad del Desarrollo. Thank you. Two comments. I'm the last speaker now because I'll give you an additional view to everything that's been mentioned. And I'd like to tell you that my presentation is going to have two parts. The first one is aligned with what was previously mentioned. The second part is that my peers can feel identified by what the second part is about. We've heard that the reality we've analyzed sets up a scenario which is complex, it's frail, it's lacks safety, security, it's quite hostile. I'm also taking elements from the same title of our panel. As I said, my invitation is to extend our perspective, to reconceptualize some terms, considering other ways of threat, the lack of protection, regression, hostility that are to be presented to drive debate and reflection. From different methodological developments and perspectives, journalists in Latin America, specifically in Chile, have become subject of study that are critical when we go deep into journalistic production processes and the conditions of journalism. Since we don't have that much time, I'm going to focus on Chile, and I'm going to take information from the RP study made up by researchers, investigators from Chile, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, where I was lucky enough to participate. This emerged to permanently study the mechanisms that journalists use to gather, select, and publish information. These data, the ones that I'm presenting now, and I don't want you to just stay with numbers, but with the idea, hopefully, first to discuss in the questions. It was 200 interviews, but I'm focusing on the 40 that we held in Chile. I'm going to present three axes, which I believe are worth noting. First of all, we've got the political pressure. It's common that we have cases where we're ordering the journalists, since they have information on political parties without any coherent motive on contingency, they call the professionals of communication, people in the public sphere that wrote something that is not favorable to them, to complain about that. In some cases, they even disqualify the authors of the news. They also insist media for them to cover activities in its extreme sometimes. That pressure is sometimes customized in order not to publish information that was already reported. So is this another type of threat? Posing the question here. It exists. When we go into the negotiation dynamics with journalists, we have different information exchange for favors. If the competition publishes the information, they do it, and it can become a bit complicated for the journalist who originally do not want to publish something. The politician sees at the end that they'll stop providing information to the media. It's other types of aggression. Let's think about the conditions associated with social pressure and or the public. We can see that social associations think that the media are at their service, and they give instructions to journalists for them to cover. In the case they deny, they tell the journalists they work for the bourgeois. Now we have the influence of public and audience, which can vary. We have citizen demand and radio that's always been quite robust, strong, which increased after February 2010, where the radio had a quite critical role. And I'm saying this because I'm from Concepcion, and I know this. And now journalists are facing a sea of people that think they have news when it's not necessarily the case. And this happens, this pressure happens in any place, right? In offices, in the streets. Social topics can spontaneously appear and modify the agenda of social media, which has led people to think that their information must be published in an instant manner, despite the fact it's not news. That's something we can talk about, right? The news factors that happens in digital media and in smaller towns. In digital media, since I'm mentioning this, criticism is raw, ruthless, without minding the quality. There's criticism without grounds, even sometimes, especially the violent. We distinguish the violent character of the violent nature of all this in the publications. Now, this is also driven by lower wages, which is associated to journalists, right? For the most part, I'm thinking about the Rower Picard publication in another context. He said why journalists deserve to win a low wage and or earn it, and the transport in the daily agenda. I could continue. I'm going to go to my main idea this morning. If we talk about insecurity, we must also consider the uncertainty of many professionals, thanks to the precariousness of their contractor link with their employers, or the lack of a trade association they have in an association of journalists, which I must recognize is weak. If we consider precariousness, we must also discuss about the wage ability which derives and stems from what I just mentioned, exacerbated by the recognized crisis of the media in the face of the collapse of the traditional business model. If we talk about threats, we must consider the lack of acknowledgement and exclusivity, which determines an economic and social devaluation in the face of an increase of a media structure that is parallel with no type of ethical or legal control or rule. What I'm mentioning is not an antagonic view. It's complementary to what we just mentioned. This must all drive us to a final reflection. What I'll manifest here is not necessarily going to represent everyone here present and our colleagues, but we must discuss on the legal and ethical status of media. In the first place, what does it mean to be a media today in Chile? Can you tell me what someone can tell me what the law says? But I believe we have much to discuss rooted on the explosion of social media and the contribution of different peripheral alternative remote media, pseudo media, digital media. There's many names for it, but I like pseudo media, which enjoy quite much fidelity and popularity of users, like Professor Valenzuela mentioned this morning. They're outside of all regulatory demands established in Law 19,733. Now, we must discuss the legal status and ethical status of the professional figure. I agree with this. We are going through an universalistic stage based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being has a right to free speech, to investigate, receive opinions, and disseminate them without frontiers. We could even say and think about Article 19, number 12 in our Constitution, when it speaks about the freedom to issue opinions and prior informed consent without, notwithstanding the abuses that are done within the exercise of that law pursuant to the law. But in times of these striking phenomena or galloping phenomena, which are quite present, do we consider information as a social good or asset that must be protected or not? If the answer is yes, that means that we need to create an urgent debate on all these matters to solve this question. Can anyone inform? I'm going to close with the quote of Jose Maria de Santo, author of Theory, The Right to Information in Spanish, when they say, open quote, social communication is something too serious to just leave it for improvisation. To provide the social service that this imposes, it's necessary, we need to train and be able to provide service means that we must be in conditions to provide the service. So no, no, it's not that just anyone can inform. Acknowledging information as a right of vital importance, as per what the minister mentioned this morning, to recognize this must lead us to recognize a professional subject which through a tacit recognition of society, and just due to that importance, it assumes the satisfaction of that duty, that right, turning it into its duty. And those that are informed professionally, despite the fact that I do think that those who don't do it in a professional manner, they must professionally, they must develop this important role in an environment, or they should not develop this in an unprotected or aggressive or hostile environment. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. We'd like to thank you for leaving some time for the rest of us. If anyone wants to ask any questions, we have a couple minutes, a couple more minutes. I'd like to highlight the last presentation of Fernando Gutierrez, because I think that it touches upon some things that are critical. All of us were outraged in the face of the threats to press, violence against our journalists. But many times we fall into a game, deceitful game, of pretending the press itself cannot have any type of supervision. Now, in the backdrop, the real question is, who supervises press? Who intervenes when the press undergoes abuse, which causes chain reactions, would end up deteriorating reliability on media and on journalists? We must remember that since dictatorship, ethical control, not only in journalism but in different professions, was eliminated at once. And there is a great struggle of journalists where we try to include this into the law and press enacted under the government of Ricardo Lagos to go back to professional schools and ethical control of their associates. And in the case of journalism, not only journalists but restitute the people that incur or go or attack or have ethical violations against the right to information and communication. Long story short, none of these initiatives have been implemented in the law on press and the press law on Ricardo Lagos. They included the right of journalists to appeal to a conscience clause to not undergo any erroneous information or information that do not respond to the ethical criteria and veracity criteria. But there's no record of a journalist that wanted to apply this due to the labor precariousness we live. So I think that despite the fact that these are alarming numbers, what we have to do is we have to fight for two things, which I believe are critical. One is ethical control, independent, and the entrepreneurial matters. And another element, which is quite important to my judgment, is to be able to establish defense mechanisms, advocacy that aim for there being more professional independence regarding the factual powers that the large media control. Thank you. I think this is complementary to my question. It's regarding the traditional role that the press had on the control of being the guardian dog, right? The control of exerting power, which is controlled by stigmatization on behalf of politicians, which is quite easy, accountable or for them, right? Targeting media to undermine everything because given the fact that the same politicians are being questioned, for them it's more profitable to undermine the rule of the media when they do not agree, when they feel uncomfortable. So my question is, do you have any reflections on how this role of the guardian dog is faced when we see that the control is being covered in an unloyal manner in terms of the control of power, the principles that exert democracy, instead of proposing the divergencies as being stigmatized or tackled with unloyal tools. Okay, let's give the floor to one of the speakers before we go into another question. Microphone, sir, please. I'm sorry, the microphone is off. For example, the observatory, when it launches this campaign that we must not attack the press because it stigmatizes it, and because we don't have the mechanism is there, that constitutional right that we don't need to use libel and slander. For example, when the observatory has made these campaign, created this campaign, people criticize this. They say, okay, what happens with journalists? They can say anything. No one controls them. There's no ethical control. We must insult them. And I do think that we have an antidote, and the antidote is that press itself has to self audit itself, right? But all the accountability in the sector has to be accountable. And I'm talking about one of the drivers of accountability in Chile, because you've driven this type of models, those of you here. Unfortunately, the models we have are quite weak, and they're not as intense. So what I'd say is the guard dog needs its own guardian dog, right? It needs it, but it does not have it. If you need a mechanism and the society and community sees that the journalist is told upon when he or demanded to be more rigorous for his work, if we knew the standards, it'd be harder to stigmatize them. It'd be even harder because you already have an entity that does that. If the sector doesn't do it, the state will. But I know it's a cost, but that's abiding. The audit benefits the trade association, the union of the press, right? Put people, put people there that make people uncomfortable there in that entity. If you do not have an ethics committee that is awkward or uncomfortable for people, and from my experience, I feel like it does not do it now, right? We need to intensify what we have and have more mechanisms. For example, in TVN, we're proposing the fact that there's a public advocacy, right? In TVN, it makes sense because it's a public system for us to be able to reach there and to fight. Remember in CNTV, I don't like the TV system because I think it's a bit old fashioned and it has a lot to do with public intervention, but there's a positive effect to a preventive, and a preventive effect is that thanks to that, mostly everything is channeled through CNTV, right? And since I can send a complaint, I have to do it. I do not have to write down a tweet or tweet against a journalist. Nevertheless, that does not happen, right? People don't even know that your organism exists because they don't have that much presence in networks. So that's where people send their uneasiness, right? When you say, like, I don't like what the journalist said, instead of insulting the journalist or tweeting against them, you can file a claim. We have mechanisms, but it's we need to work on them. We've detected orchestrated attacks against pressers, political parties, and sectors that have campaigns organized to to reduce the press, right? And we've got the case of Mexico. It's a government strategy, but in Chile we're seeing the first organized attacks, buying bots, and generating hostility. And all the political parties are doing it somehow. So let's go to the triangle somehow. I'll try to be brief, even more than Sebastian. I feel like the figure as a professional subject of the figure of the journalist in Chile, I think that we're quite isolated, alone. Where I say alone is that we need to fulfill our role without backup, because I will go and look at this and we're somehow unprotected. And that's why unprotected legally and ethically speaking. And that we leave it at the arbitration of the contract with the employer and the contractual link. And we know that we all have the needs of having wages, resources, funding our lives, living, etc. I fully agree with what Javier said. I think that we need to strengthen the fact that there is a stronger mechanism to to have this guardian dog, right? I think that there's many declarations, there's a lot of speeches, but when we go into practice, there's a project which is called conditioned journalism, a project we've worked on, right? When journalists tell about how they fulfill their role, they say, okay, let me tell you in which conditions. Let me tell you in which conditions. They said that all the time. So we said, okay, let's generate this project. And there's other interviews we did because the conditions in which these were developed make the speech fall apart. We all wish we had a strong press. Everyone recognizes that press is great for the development of democracy. It's fundamental. But in practice, this falls apart because there's no social recognition either. If we had this opening a structure, which I insist should come from the legal point of view, but also the ethical point of view, I think that we have raised the Journalists Association of less than 5%, whereas our other 95%, which is what I say with the students, who's regulating the other 95%? Which standards are we working with? Self-regulation, I'm quite critical. This does not work, but and I agree with Javier, and I'm a member of the ethics council, the media, and part of a new wave of people that are trying to make this ethics concept and the federation media. We want to make this more robust. Maria Jose is also there. We want to make this more robust, and hopefully we can have a second match there. Now we have time for one more questions. Please try to ask a short question. We know that we have many of you anxious to ask. Okay, can you hear me? I'm Nicole Venegas. I'm part of an NGO that's called Flame Tracker, which trains journalists, environmental journalists. I wanted to share with you that we had a workshop with journalists of Latin America a couple of weeks ago, and it's great to relate this to what you mentioned because it was a safety security workshop where these journalists identified less than one third of the people that attended, which were journalists from different countries, considered that it was important to have safety security protocols. There was no notion, even in journalists, of the importance of having safety security protocols, and in the environmental field too, right? There's an exposure to biological risk and different risks. So I think that this was addressed because many of these journalists were freelancers. So I think that talking about journalisms and journalists and only linking them to communications or media, it's something that we must not generalize because there's freelance journalists, right? What our colleague was mentioning before regarding TVN, that the cameramen did not know about the protocols. If their own workers of a traditional media do not know about the protocols, I can't even imagine what happens with the rest, right? How can we advance the progress for freelance journalists to also be able to have protocols? And yesterday, in one of the panels, there's a photojournalist from Peru, and he told us that they had self-managed protocols, and they asked human rights organizations for advice to see what they did, and that gave rise to a debate because I think that these situations happen because we ask ourselves, journalists, what is the mechanism to advance in security, protection, and resilience in coverage? And just like there's people that speak about advancing towards a trade association or union, yesterday in the panel we also said that the trade associations or unions do not enjoy great health per se in Chile. There's people in other countries where they were betting or enjoying from the trade associations maybe because they were stronger, and they spoke about knitting collaborative networks, creating them, working as teams. So my question is, what do you think about this? Incorporating journalists not only that work in traditional media, but those that are freelancers. Thank you. Anyone? Just 1 minute to any of the journalists that want to answer this.
Thank you for that question. Now, going back to the experience that we had in these exploratory interviews with different journalists from different areas, when we observed or when we analyzed the interviews to journalists in the South, they work for media, they are freelance, they are not hired. However, given that they were placed in this very conflictive area, it's set up upon them to have resources and ask training to police officers, to the army. 100% of these did the war journalists course, and then they self-manage. They went and report together. They get organized. Not all of them belong to the organizations of journalists. There's a more strong presence. There's a stronger presence of the regional journalists associations. We did observe this, and they do communicate for the big media. Only two of them have life insurance, and only two of them were hired, and the rest of them were freelance. And the profile is always young people that are just starting their careers, that are exposing themselves. So that's where the interesting things happened. We didn't have the capacity to reach the north, where we wanted to see how they were living this, but we did know that it was atomized. There is no presence of the media covering this. We didn't know why, but we did reach some of them. But we wanted to have journalists with degrees. And now the discussion is about these communicators that do not have their professional degrees, but that they are exercising this task. In the central area, these journalists are research journalists specialized in conflicts, where they do have all these expertise, but from their own experience and under the direction of their own media. But it's those journalists that cover very complicated events. And another thing, these journalists that had had experiences in other countries, either Mexico or Colombia, they shared about the similarities that they observed in other countries and what they saw in the north and in the south, according to those points. But something that you're sharing, the freelance journalist that doesn't have a contract, they get organized. There are groups, and this is where we see organizations like, for example, the regional chapters that allow to create networks with people with trained professionals to provide these training sessions. Thank you, Paulina, so much. I know that this is a very interesting issue. However, time has run out. I want to thank you for attending this panel. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to invite you and tell you that at 2 p.m. we're going to keep going with the conferences in Universidad de Chile. Thank you so much for attending.